I got seas going right across my deck here now. I did not run up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is Goose 2. Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner. I'll be joined by Taylor as usual. But first, we have quite a few new patrons to thank. So a big Beyond the Breakers thank you to Tom, Nan, John, Jody, and RCP. So thank you to all of you for getting on board with us on Patreon. We hope you enjoy the old stuff that's up there that hasn't been released to the public just yet. And we have some cool new stuff coming to Patreon in the near future. So with that, Taylor, how is it going?
Not too bad. Getting ready for Christmas time and all of that, but it's pretty good. How about you? I hear you guys are about to get some snow, right?
Yes, it's going to start snowing at like 9 in the morning tomorrow and snow through Friday, I think. So I'm working from home. We don't have students right now, so there's really no reason for us to all go into the office. So that is kind of nice. I had the last 2 days off just taking vacation. The HR at my company is consistently has to like threaten me to take vacation days because like I so rarely have a reason to use them because like our classes go year round, and so like we have the break weeks, and so if I don't use them during a break week, they build up so fast. I know it's a good problem to have, but
yeah, truly.
I'm taking off all of next week too during Christmas. So yeah, we have a big episode in front of us here, but before we get to that, what have you been up to media-wise?
I have started, on your recommendation, SPQR. It's a history of ancient Rome by Mary Beard, and it's really good. Like it's kind of changing some of my perceptions about Rome. Like you don't realize that like the Rome of Caesar is very different than like the Rome 200 years later. It's a lot more dynamic than I think we think of it.
I'm especially interested in like the early Roman Republic is really interesting. And I read that book a few years ago. It was probably like 2017, 2018. And I liked that book because it reminded me of the class I took in college. I think it's sophomore year of college. I took a class called, I think it was called Ancient Roman Society and Culture. And it did cover Roman history. So like we talked about the emperors and like battles and, military campaigns and stuff. But we also talked about, Roman drama and Roman comedy. We read Petronius in addition to, of course, reading like the Aeneid and stuff like that. And kind of like you just said, becoming familiar with Rome as a culture rather than just, typical boy stuff, reading about the Battle of Cannae and, reading about, Caesar and conquering Britain and whatnot. But yeah, learning about, Roman food and Roman poetry and Roman plays was really it really made it seem a lot bigger and a lot more full, since men are supposed to think about the Roman Empire once a day. It gives you more to think about.
Yeah, it's been really good. The other thing is I finished Breaking Bad and I watched El Camino. It actually, I enjoyed it. It was just like a 2-hour episode of Breaking Bad, essentially. Surprised it was really good. I know I'm breaking news there by telling everyone that Breaking Bad is a good show, but I'm glad I watched it. It was good. I kind of like how it's done, that it doesn't necessarily glamorize anything about that. It kind of shows you how it ends poorly for everybody. Yeah, so that was good. What about you? What have you been up to?
I have been trying to do a lot of reading since I've had a bit more free time recently. I am reading the next Captain a la Triste book by Arturo Perez Reverte. This one is El Caballero del Jubón Amarillo.
Interesting.
The Cavalier in the Yellow Doublet, I guess is what we would translate. I don't even know what the word would be in English. The thing that goes over your other clothes.
Like an overcoat?
I don't actually know what the book is called in English. I'm not liking this one as much as some of the others. But again, I like reading those just as much for practice as anything else. In terms of, if I were reading them in English, I would probably put them on par with something like the Sharp novels in terms of their, I don't know the word I'm looking for, like rigor. in terms of like reading. You know, they're not challenging books to read, but they are fun.
Like it's an action book. It's like the equivalent of watching like an action movie.
Yeah, exactly. It's like that.
Sometimes you just have to watch behind enemy lines.
Yeah, and so like we're doing it because you know it's good reading practice. You know, you're always picking up new phrases and new ways to say things. So that's kind of the benefit of reading those. Kitty and I actually have our plan for this upcoming year. We're both going to read. We both have wanted to reread The Wheel of Time for quite a while, and so I've reread the first like 3 books in that series several times. So I've read Eye of the World like 5 or 6 times because I've always wanted to reread the series, but I have usually not gotten much past that. But we're both going to reread The Wheel of Time because she only read through about book 6 or 7, I think, when she initially tried to read it. She's going to read it in French and I'm going to read it in Spanish. So we're both going to practice our like primary second language while revisiting The Wheel of Time.
That is an incredibly complex thing. I love it.
Other reading stuff. I panicked the other day because I looked up to the framed portrait of Walter Scott that we have in our living room, and I realized I have not read my Walter Scott for the year. I typically read about 1 a year, sometimes more if I'm really feeling it. And I realized I have not read one this year. I still have a few unread. I mean, there's several unread, but we physically own several that I have not read. So I grabbed The Bride of Lammermoor off of the shelf. It's kind of starts as a pretty typical Walter Scott. It's one of the Tales of My Landlord series. The Walter Scott books are weird. He's got his Waverly novels that he wrote like semi-anonymously, and then there's like a subset of those that are Tales of My Landlord. So it's confusing. But again, I really enjoy all of the Walter Scott books that I've read. I think by far Old Mortality is my favorite. Waverly's really good. Rob Roy was pretty good.
You should maybe start like a group at the local elementary school where they read they learn it at an early age. Did appreciate Walter Scott
Tots?
And call it Scott's Tots.
I could do that. That's
you
true.
could.
So that's what I've been up to. Oh, I also rewatched The Terror in full over the span of a couple days after Terror Camp, which was amazing. I was inspired to say, I need to actually rewatch this series, and it was so cool rewatching it now with the knowledge that there's this like huge community of people that are like really into The Terror.
Honestly, I think the most surprising thing since starting this podcast is learning how many people love that show. Like, it's such a cool community.
I guess we didn't really address this, but we should probably mention it maybe at the beginning. This is going to be the last main episode of the season, I'm assuming, unless you have something hidden.
No hidden gems here.
Okay, so we're going into this saying this will be our finale for the whole season, finishing up this ever-growing series on the Torrey Canyon. We have a lot to get through. Again, this is a huge story with lots of different facets, so naturally some of it had to get cut out just for the sake of time and sanity for the people assembling the episode. But a quick overview of where we left off. Part 2 ended with the dramatic explosion on the Torrey Canyon that led to the only human fatality of the incident. Salvage Chief Hans Stahl of the Weissmuller Salvage Company was struck by a piece of debris and died of his wounds while being transported to the mainland. That explosion had occurred after the first unsuccessful attempts to pull the Torrey Canyon off of Seven Stones Reef. It was becoming increasingly clear that salvaging her would be a losing battle, although efforts would continue for some time. So, getting into the cleanup. The Torrey Canyon had run aground on the morning of March 18th, 1967. By the night of Thursday, March 23rd, an estimated 30,000 tons of oil had already spilled from the stranded tanker.
I think something like that, when I hear a number like 30,000 tons, I just have no concept of how much that actually is. You know what I mean? Like, you could tell me that's a lot or a little, and I'd be like, yeah, okay.
I guess that would be about a quarter of the oil she was carrying.
Right.
If my memory serves correctly.
That 30,000 tons is only a quarter of what she's carrying. It's like an unknowable, like, it's like, you can understand the number, but like, it's hard to conceive of that.
Yeah, we talked about it a bit in the last episode, but it's like, if a ship like this were to lose 1,000 tons of oil somehow, that sounds like a lot of oil, and it really is. But like, from the perspective of the ship, like if you're the company, you're like, well, that's not much oil to lose.
Right.
Fortunately for Cornwall, there was a consistent northerly wind blowing, which directed the bulk of the growing oil slick away from the beaches.
I guess the bad thing about that is that it has to go somewhere else.
Right, but it's not going here, so... Actually, that is... could talk about this here. One thing I did just have to cut out from this, just because I couldn't squeeze it into the notes, is it does go somewhere, and that somewhere is mostly France. So the beaches of Brittany actually do suffer quite a bit from this spill.
It's like the most British thing ever is still getting at France, even with your with your like disasters.
Even though there was no immediately imminent threat to the beaches of Cornwall, there was no guarantee that this would remain the case. Hence, the beginning of efforts to contain and counteract the spill. Quote here from Richard Petrow, unless otherwise noted, any quotes in this episode are from that Petrow book, In the Wake of Torrey Canyon. There will be some other sources coming up later, but this is from Petrow.
The principal weapons used against the oil were emulsifiers, more commonly known as detergents. Helicopter pilots flying over the waters off Cornwall during the first week after the grounding saw a vast fleet of destroyers, tugs, torpedo boats, minesweepers, and fishing craft weaving back and forth through the oil, cutting temporary blue swaths in the dark brown mass.
On board, men wearing goggles sprayed colorless liquid onto the sea. This was the detergent. Through trial and error, the Navy had evolved a method for using the detergent. It had to be sprayed in a fine mist over the largest possible area of oil. Then, the vessel ran through the slick again to agitate with its propeller the oil and the detergent.
Before Torrey Canyon struck, the Royal Navy stocked small quantities of cleansing agent called gamelin at all its dockyards. Gamelin is an expensive and sophisticated detergent that had proved very effective in breaking down floating oil. When the minesweeper Clabberston reached the scene on Saturday, she carried 1,000 gallons of gamelin. Before the first week was over, however, all available stocks of gamelin had been used, and a call went out to major manufacturers of detergent for additional supplies.
So, foremost among these suppliers was... who else? British Petroleum.
Oh no.
That's actually whose oil this is also. I don't think that came up in a main episode yet, but this is BP oil that's being spilled.
Oh no, we can sell something that'll fix the problem we caused.
Yes. BP oil, the cause and solution to all of life's problems. So BP would be producing 40,000 gallons a day of this detergent, BP 1002, within a very short time for use on the spill.
That's so nice of them to maybe make a little less oil and put a little more effort into this.
Well, the oil might be better for the ocean than this detergent. We'll talk about that more later. The way that these detergents worked was a two-step process. So step one was the petroleum solvent in the detergent that would thin the oil, and then a surface active agent that coated individual droplets, which would separate from one another and remain suspended in the water. And then, presumably, just disperse and to be dealt with by natural processes.
Disperse where?
Just wherever.
Just not in Cornwall.
What it's basically doing is it's breaking it up so that it's not this big, huge coating of oil. It's, breaking it down into the finest possible little droplets it can, which is theoretically better for the environment.
Mm-hmm.
On March 24th, which was Good Friday, 1967.
Doesn't sound like a very good Friday to me.
Something not so good happened. The consistent northerly wind that had been blowing since the grounding shifted to the southwest, which would send it toward the beaches of Cornwall.
Not the beaches of Cornwall.
In response to this change, Under Secretary of the Navy Maurice Foley convened an emergency meeting in Truro of local government authorities to assess their readiness to deal with oil coming ashore. What he found was not promising. Which, I mean, is unsurprising, because again, we said this is a...
Who was sitting around waiting for this?
No one is prepared for this. Richard Petrow provides some of the content of this meeting, starting with a question from Undersecretary Foley and dealing with an exchange with Borough Surveyor Stuart Kneebone.
That's not a real last name someone has. I would now like to know what you local authorities have done to help yourselves if the oil is to come ashore, he said. Throughout the auditorium, not a man stood in response. They had not expected to be called upon. This is no time for complacency, Foley admonished. I will hold any authority responsible for culpable complacency.
Foley went down the list. St. Ives and Helston, Camborne and West Penwith, Redruth, and Tiny Carrier. Then, St. Just.
Would the representative from St. Just like to inform us what his district has done to prepare for the crisis?
Kneebone stood up. We've been trying to get detergent, he answered.
How much have you managed to stockpile? Foley demanded.
Our total stock, Kneebone replied, is 1 45-gallon drum. Kneebone explained that he had asked the Navy for more detergent, but had been informed that none was available.
The Navy's like, listen, we'd love to give you more. We don't have any.
It is interesting how the stuff is available, but no one's thinking of needing nearly enough that you would need for this kind of thing. A 45-gallon drum.
It's like taking a squirt gun to like a fire.
Another meeting was held later that same afternoon in Penzance for the 3 West Cornwall districts of Penzance, St. Just, and West Penwith. That could be pronounced like Penneth or something.
I'm assuming that most of these are pronounced in a non-obvious way.
West Peneth.
This is fine. We're of British heritage. We can do this.
This was also the first meeting with the coordinator, who would be handling the military response, Royal Marine Colonel Pat Ovens. The efforts would be technically led by the civil authorities with the Army and Navy as support, though since they were the ones bringing most of the relevant expertise and equipment to bear, the military would make most of the decisions about how these would get deployed.
Oh, that's good. I'm sure the military love being told by civilians what to do.
Right.
Especially when they're bringing all the toys to the party.
The oil arrived overnight, with the first portions of the slick coming ashore at Lizard Point on the southern coast of Cornwall.
I'm picturing them doing the Winston Churchill, we shall fight them on the beaches speech, but about the oil.
We actually talked about the Lizard in the Spanish Armada series. It was off the Lizard that the Armada was first encountered.
Nothing good gets sighted at the Lizard.
Oil was also sighted approaching the beaches north of Land's End at Sennin Cove.
A grim sight confronted Cornwall when it awoke that morning. Once lovely beaches were befouled by an evil-smelling blanket of heavy crude oil. Looking seaward, horrified watchers saw a black tide of oil rolling in, piling more pollution on the beaches already hit, and inundating with new oil those beaches that had escaped the first wave.
At Sennin Cove, the oil built up on the beach until it was roughly a foot deep.
That's a lot of oil.
According to the estimation of Parish Councillor Leslie Shannon. One of the hardest hit areas on the south coast of Cornwall would be the village of Porthleven. In Porthleven Harbour, an estimated 4 inches of oil had built up, with more oil being consistently pushed into the harbour by the wind. One of the things here where there's a lot of these sheltered coves and harbours in this area, which is great for boating purposes. Problem here being that once the oil is in there, it won't come out. And it keeps piling up higher and higher on the beaches and even, on the surface of the water. Chapter 8 of the Petrow book details the haphazard and largely ineffective nature of the initial responses to the oil. The biggest problem was the thickness of the oil. The detergents were simply never going to work with this kind of concentration.
Yeah, that's something that I guess I hadn't thought about is usually I think about it as with a shipwreck. You think of a U-boat or something where it sinks a vessel and there's oil in the water. But it's not concentrated like this, that this is a syrup almost.
I'm assuming that what the Navy had on hand was probably intended to be used if one ship is leaking oil or something into the harbor and you need to deal with it.
Yeah, and a lot of it's probably in in harbor, like doing repairs and things like that. Like you're going to have spills and things.
Presumably in hopes that increasing the concentration of detergent would have an effect, some boats began dumping barrels of detergent over the side rather than spraying it.
They're depth charging the oil.
Kind of. In at least one instance, a helicopter pilot reported a vessel dumping its detergent in clean water.
That's like they say, like whatever percentage of World War II bombers like dropped their bombs early or whatever so they could turn around.
Petrow sums up these ineffectual efforts as follows.
From the beginning, their effort was futile. A small flock of children, working alongside a few dozen civilians, and a unit of Royal Marines pouring chemical emulsifier on individual patches of oil. If their number had been increased tenfold, they could not have treated all the oil on Marazion. Even as they worked, they knew by looking out to sea that the next incoming tide would repollute the beach with a new layer of oil, as heavy, if not heavier, than the previous one.
Despite the enthusiasm from local communities and government personnel in aiding the cleanup process, it was quite apparent that more organized and concerted efforts would be needed. For these seaside communities, it really does become a full community effort. Like that quote said, you can see pictures of little kids out on the beaches just with their shovels and buckets that they should be using to play in the sand, scooping this up. You've got guys out there with shovels, just scooping these gobs of oil into buckets.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine most people's livelihood is tied to the ocean in some way, be it tourism, fishing, or something else.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I guess even if you're like the town, like a mechanic or something, like you need those fishing boats to go out so you can have something to work on.
John Sheail, I think is maybe how the name is pronounced, writing in Torrey Canyon, The Political Dimension, cites the opinions of L.R. Binion, a scientist from BP's Technical Development Division.
Binion, in his reports to BP, found the oil and beach conditions to be so variable that no single prescription sufficed. What particularly concerned him were the almost private battles being fought, the detergent being sprayed and slopped in a remarkably inefficient and wasteful manner. He warned of how it was only a matter of time before the press accused the oil companies, as manufacturers of the detergent, of profiting from such extravagance and malpractice.
Would hate for an oil company to profiteer from malpractice.
Wait, this guy works for BP, right?
He is. He's a BP scientist.
Like, that's not good when, like, the BP guy's like, hey, guys.
We need to get ahead of this.
Much.
That article, Torrey Canyon, The Political Dimension, that is from the Journal of Contemporary History from 2007. Soon, a clearer division of labor would be established, with local authorities focusing on beaches, harbors, and estuaries, while the deployed military personnel would focus on the rockier and harder-to-access areas. Another part of this more concerted effort was the promise of financial support from the national level. Interestingly enough, Prime Minister Harold Wilson had been vacationing for the Easter holiday on the Isles of Scilly, giving him close to a front-row seat to the incident. In addition to Navy Undersecretary Maurice Foley, Wilson also tapped Home Secretary Roy Jenkins, not Leroy Jenkins, mind you, to lead the cleanup efforts. Anthony Greenwood, the Minister of Housing and Local Government, was dispatched to Cornwall to meet with community members and primarily to address issues of financial support for the cleanup.
Local authorities would not have to pay for detergent or the expenses for the troops. In addition, the Exchequer would pay 75% of all other expenses, leaving only 25% for the local authorities to shoulder. Even this burden would be limited, however. The government would pay all of that portion of the 25% that could not be covered by a 2-penny increase in the rates.
So they basically give them a deductible. And
right.
Once they hit it, they don't have to pay for the other parts of it.
It's fun. This is essentially how American health insurance works, except you still might have to pay even when you hit it. Surprise.
The beaches, they actually have a pre-existing condition of being too close to these oil shipping lanes, so that's not going to be covered,
they have to
unfortunately.
turn that one down.
Financial assurances were all well and good, but there was still the issue of the Torrey Canyon herself, still stranded where she had run aground and still leaking massive amounts of oil into the sea. So on Easter Sunday, Prime Minister Wilson convened an emergency cabinet meeting at Culdrose Naval Air Station, after which he held a press conference to discuss some of the conclusions reached in the meeting. Chief among these was a warning/reminder to the owners of Torrey Canyon and to the Weissmuller Salvage Company that even if the tanker could be refloated, the UK would not guarantee access to a British port.
While a final decision must await the refloating, if this is achieved, the owners and the salvage company are aware that it is not the government's present intention to allow entry into territorial waters.
If a theoretically refloated Torrey Canyon couldn't dock in the UK, she would need to look elsewhere, but it was doubtful if any other nation would accept the risk either.
I'm sure you could take it somewhere, but it would be a long ways away. Just taking it out to the middle of the Atlantic and cutting the line, like, I don't know what happened to it.
I mean, that's basically the suggestion here.
The only direction a refloated Torrey Canyon could safely take to avoid any further pollution of the shores of England would be westward into the Atlantic, and the Atlantic would be her graveyard. By placing British territorial waters off limits, Wilson had adroitly applied pressure on the owners to give up the salvage attempt.
Small quibble with that quote. Wouldn't it just be her grave?
Yeah.
Since just like one
thing.
I think
even if she split in two, it still would be a graveyard because it's the same pieces.
I mean, if you cut a body in half, it's still, one grave if you put it together.
Really cut a body into infinite pieces and it's still like one.
Yeah.
You would need at least one other body.
One other oil tanker in this case. John Sheail in Torrey Canyon, The Political Dimension, also suggests that Wilson was looking for a quick solution to the incident to avoid leaving the UK potentially on the hook for damages to beaches in France, Spain, or Portugal.
This is very much like a just make it go away so we can't see it kind of thing.
Well, and there's a lot of cool aspects to the story. That's why some of those other sources were interesting, looking at it from, one looks specifically at the community aspect of it. One looks at the political dimension that we were just quoting here. There's so much to this story. There's so many different things it touches on, and that's why it has expanded into such a big episode. However, the discussion of where to send the Torrey Canyon would be rendered entirely academic when a helicopter pilot above the wreck site reported that the stranded tanker had, quote, broken her back and was in the process of breaking up.
I'm sure the owner and salvage people are like, yes, thank you.
Well, I mean, that's going to cost them a lot of money.
Yeah, but at least it's not like their problem at this point.
At least they don't have to do it anymore.
Yeah, like they already were going to have some money issues. Now at least the problem's gone.
The next part getting into, so salvage efforts are not really going to be successful. Let's back it up just a little bit to see what had been going on since the death of Hans Stahl.
Mm-hmm.
Salvage efforts had continued, but they had met with, obviously, no success. The efforts on that Easter Sunday afternoon, involving all 4 available tugs, had pushed the already tenuous situation to the breaking point. The cable to Utrecht and Praia de Andraga snapped, leaving Titan and Stentor to continue the final effort to pull the Torrey Canyon from the rocks.
As they pulled, and as the seas pounded Torrey Canyon, the sturdy hull of the tanker reached its breaking point. Not in an instant, but slowly, bending and groaning, gradually distorting itself. Its midsection humped higher than its stern and bow, like an angle iron with its ends embedded in rock and hidden by the sea. She was slowly breaking her back. The metal gave way just behind the bridge. As she tore apart, cargo tanks that had been up till then been unruptured ripped open, pouring thousands of tons of new oil into the sea.
So they're actually making this a lot worse.
Yeah, like I feel like this is almost like a separate spill at this point. It's like you had one and now you're going to have another.
I understand that like salvage is a tricky job and their boss got killed. But it seems like they haven't really tried anything different. It seems like they're still just hooking these things and yanking as hard as they can. To a man with only a tugboat, everything looks like a stranded tanker. They're just pulling as hard as they can. And again, it doesn't work. And here, in this case, it actually pulls the ship apart. As Easter Sunday turned to Monday, it was now 10 days since the tanker had grounded, and the UK government was facing accusations of being overly deferential to the owners of the vessel in waiting for her to be salvaged.
I mean, 10 days is a long time to, like, not really have done anything constructive.
Conservative MP John Knott wondered if other nations would be so accommodating.
Can anyone believe if a British tanker had gone aground outside New York Harbor, that President Johnson would still have been negotiating with the British owners 10 days later?
The answer is no, because we know how President Johnson liked to negotiate. Either
Jumbo would have been there to negotiate.
Either while he was actively using the toilet or with his penis on the desk. Criticism of leadership was not just confined to the Tories. Wilson was from the Labour Party, but you had other, you had kind of all around criticism here of some of this inaction. The government was forced to take decisive action on the stricken tanker. With the detergent operations deemed an overall failure, a new approach was needed. Monday night, Home Secretary Roy Jenkins gathered other ministers at Culdrose Naval Air Station near St. Ives to discuss new tactics for dealing with the oil. Quoting from John Sheail in Torrey Canyon, The Political Dimension.
Jenkins saw a political advantage in having so well publicized a meeting. He had been considerably disturbed by reports in the Sunday newspapers of increasing pollution and of the very low morale among local authorities. Secondly, the meeting would put further pressure upon ministers to bring different chains of command under his unified control. Although troops to fight the oil on the beaches had been placed under the nominal control of local councils, so as not to deter those councils from playing their full part, Army commanders wanted to be brought under a single civilian minister.
So back to your point about, did the military guys like being put under civilian command? The answer might be yes, as long as there was like one guy in charge who could coordinate things. Not every little
like
mayor is in charge of their own little detachment.
Can you imagine if every mayor just had their own little battalion to order around here in America?
This sounds like a tailor-made situation for the No Gods, No Mayors podcast. Resulting from this meeting, the Commander-in-Chief of Naval Forces in Plymouth drafted a message to his colleague, Commander of the Royal Air Station at Lossiemouth in Scotland. The message read,
Question. Let me have your suggestions on how you would rupture oil compartments and ignite contents of Torrey Canyon.
45 minutes later, the reply.
Answer. Bombing with 1,000-pound medium-capacity high-explosive bombs. Attacking from side to which ship is listing to achieve penetration without ricochets.
It seems very succinct, I'm sure, because it's just in like written message form, but it seems like this guy's thought of this before. Like he has a...
It only took him 45 minutes to be really confident to send it. And it's not like they had email.
Probably the most well-known part of the Torrey Canyon story is the bombing. But that actually was not the first thing they tried in order to ignite this oil.
Also, if I was the Air Force guy and the Navy guys calling me, asking me like ship questions, I'd be like, isn't this kind of your thing?
This is kind of your circus, isn't it? I don't know. It's the late 60s. Has the RAF been bombing anything recently at this point?
I'm sure that overseas they bomb something.
Looking for something to bomb. Probably not going to complain about it.
That is true. If you ask like any Air Force person, like, you want to drop some bombs on stuff? Yep.
Do you want to bomb something that has literally no chance of firing back? The first thing was actually an attempt to use oxygenated incendiary bricks, which had been successfully tested on a pond in Sussex.
Well, that's the same as the ocean.
So it's not exactly the same environment. But they're trying to work fast here. And I believe, I'm not 100% sure of this, I believe that testing had happened, that was happening anyway. That wasn't happening because of this spill. It's something
they didn't like intentionally kill a bunch of swans and shit by dumping some oil in a pond.
Yeah, I could be mixing that up, but I believe those tests were happening or were at least planned already. However, even on lightly polluted areas of the Torrey Canyon slick, the bricks simply didn't work. So,
let's bomb it.
As the government decided that bombing was the only option, the wisdom of this move was still being hotly contested.
That quote could be about almost anything in the last 50 years.
From that exchange we saw just now between the commanders, the goal wasn't to sink the vessel, but to essentially crack her open and burn off her remaining cargo. So, damaging her enough to break open the rest of her holds, but not enough to sink her. So this is actually a pretty delicate situation that you're trying to do with these bombs.
Wouldn't it have been easier to do this with some Navy ships?
Just big flamethrowers mounted on ships.
I mean, you could. I'm sure they have incendiary shells you could use.
Greek fire probably would have helped. When asked about any consultation with the owners of the vessel before the bombing, Home Secretary Jenkins replied, "The owners and insurers were told of the government's decision to bomb the ship Tuesday morning. We did not ask them. We told them."
That's a good one.
Well, I hear in that, or read rather off the page, and I kind of pick up some there. That's almost like trying to swing the pendulum the other way of if you're being accused of inaction and being overly deferential. Yeah, you want to come out and say, yeah, we didn't ask them. We told them.
And meanwhile, the owners are like, what did we do?
The first planes arrived on scene at 3:50 p.m. on Tuesday, March 28th. These were 8 Royal Navy Blackburn Buccaneers of the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm. The first to make an attack, and that is the term used throughout all the literature on this. The first to make their attack run was Lieutenant Commander David Howard, dropping 2 1,000-pound bombs that were both near misses. Quoting here from Petrow.
Behind Howard, a second jet with Lieutenant Commander David Mears at the controls was already in its dive. Mears had heard Howard report his miss, but very close, he comforted. Then Mears concentrated on his attack. Bombs away, he shouted. 2 1,000-pound packages of high explosives raced for the tanker. They were right on target. The stern section of Torrey Canyon exploded in a spectacular sheet of flame.
I like our little dudes rock moment there,
Right.
where Mears hears him report the miss, and he comforts him by saying, but very close. Got his boys back.
I love that these aircraft were made to go bomb the Russians or fight the Russians, and their only real use is going to be to bomb this oil tanker.
If you're one of these pilots, it's probably want to bomb something that will actually, explode. And here we go. Subsequent strikes occurred at roughly 15-second intervals, leaving James Summerlee, our helicopter pilot from Part 2, to conclude that it looked, quote, like an atomic explosion. They don't just drop a couple bombs on this thing. They subject this to an absolute barrage.
I guess I figure it costs about the same to drop 20 bombs or 2 bombs, so...
On the eastern side of St. Mary's, one of the Scillies, large crowds watched this from the shore. Among these spectators was Prime Minister Wilson himself.
This reminds me of when they shot the Chinese balloon down, off the coast of South Carolina.
As the hull of the tanker grew red from the heat, the next wave of fighters arrived. These were 26 Hawker Hunters from the RAF.
Wow, they didn't waste any time, did they? They're going to get their
No, everyone's getting involved here. They were dropping not bombs, but fuel tanks to keep feeding the fires engulfing Torrey Canyon.
We had to bomb the village to save the village.
In the process of this, I learned in the Petrow, it refers to the fuel tanks as being full of kerosene.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, that's weird. I didn't realize that jet fuel is technically just kerosene.
Essentially kerosene, yeah.
I did not know that. I think of a little lamp or something when I think of kerosene.
That's why, if you ever are at certain gas stations that sell kerosene, it'll smell like you're at the airport.
The Buccaneers returned for another round of 1,000-pound bombs.
Within 2 hours, 36,000 pounds of high explosives had been flung at the stricken ship, and more than 5,400 gallons of jet fuel jettisoned to feed the fire. But within a half hour of the last attack, The fire that had raged so fiercely during the strikes had gone out, extinguished by the sea.
The strikes were initially seen as a success, as news reports had plenty of impressive-looking footage to show the general public. You hear that the RAF and the Fleet Air Arm are going to bomb this tanker and set it on fire. You get plenty of pictures and videos of exactly that thing happening. So, I mean, if you're watching, the evening news or whatever, it looks like a success. It looks like what they wanted.
This is like when we dropped that Moab bomb in Afghanistan on some mountains.
If they'd had one, they probably would have tried it here.
Probably. There was someone probably had a real talk about, like, what if we nuked this?
Come on.
Like I'm not saying that the idea got far, but I'm saying it was probably an idea in a room at some point.
We're not going to use them for anything else. However, once the flames were out, it was painfully apparent that little progress had been made. The vessel had survived the bombing and was still leaking oil. More attacks would be needed the next day.
Would they?
But, hey, this is the late 60s. If high explosive bombs can't get the job done, what can you try? That's right.
Napalm?
Napalm.
Yes.
The attacks on this day, which is Wednesday, March 29th, included a mix of everything the assembled forces could throw at the spill. The first attack was from 3 of the RAF hunters, dropping napalm with no success. 2 more followed, dropping fuel tanks and firing rockets into the hull. There was some momentary success, but the flames quickly burned out. More Buccaneers followed with their 1,000-pound bombs. These hits were accurate, but this also didn't lead to any long-term burning.
Then more Hunter jets returned with napalm and rockets, followed by Navy Sea Vixens, also dropping napalm, followed by another wave of Buccaneers. The last into the attack was a Navy Wessex helicopter. It made a final unsuccessful attempt to burn the oil by fire bricks.
That's my favorite part of this.
That's like the make of the sticky bombs and Saving Private Ryan right there. It's down to the end.
After like the entire airborne arsenal of the United Kingdom has been dropped on this thing, and then they go back to the bricks that they tried at the beginning, and it doesn't work.
Like they have to like go to some secret British black site and pull out some Nazi World War II submarine commander and be like, "Sir, we need your services."
There was an interesting thing here, and I didn't include it in the notes, and I think it was in the Petrow that it was brought up. I don't know the quality of this information, but apparently at one of the press conferences after this, a reporter asked one of the higher ups about the napalm, asking, "Was this our napalm?" Because, again, I think the Petrow said that technically the UK didn't admit that they had or they used napalm.
Uh-huh.
So the question was, well, is this ours? And it's like, well, the napalm was sourced from, the United States, or there was kind of an evasive answer to where they got the napalm.
It was ours for a very short time.
But I mean, if you're friends with the United States, you can probably always get napalm.
We're like a drug dealer.
You know a guy. While there was a debate over the effectiveness of the bombing in regard to the cargo, it was clear that at least the wreck itself had been compromised to a permanent end. The Torrey Canyon was now in pieces at the bottom of the sea. Sheail summarizes all 3 days of work as follows.
Over 3 days, some 160,000 pounds of high explosives, 10,000 gallons of aviation kerosene, 3,000 gallons of napalm, and several rockets were used. The bombs proved the only effective method for igniting the oil. Napalm failed to sustain or spread the fires. The kerosene and rockets made no impact. The discharge of oil ceased. The very small fires suggested no significant quantities remained in the vessel.
So from the government perspective, this is painted as a success. The oil had been dealt with and the ship had been removed. Overall, it's unclear how much cargo was still on board the tanker when she was bombed. This would naturally give a lot of insight into how much oil was actually destroyed and how much had simply leaked out into the sea.
I think it's really funny that basically it was, hey, let's bomb the shit out of it. And then once we can't see it anymore, it's not our problem. That is just like a metaphor for some countries' foreign policy.
Sort of the mystery here is that from the government perspective, one of the arguments as well, we weren't able to ignite it because, most of the oil, we had burned off so much of it. So that's why it didn't catch on fire again.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like the other side of it would be like, well, I mean, this was their leaking oil for 10 days before we did anything about it. How much was really left?
Right.
So getting into some of the ecological impacts of the oil, since, the ship herself is history. In writing about the initial arrival of the oil at Port Leven, Petrow includes the following anecdote.
Early that morning, 2 of the village's old fishermen had taken up their customary spots in the glass-fronted fisherman's shelter, overlooking the inner harbor. They noticed a violent thrashing was taking place in the dark brown lake that the day before had been Port Leven's harbor.
Something was trying to escape from the oil. As the 2 old fishermen looked, the shape of the struggling creature became recognizable.
It was a seabird swimming under the oil and trying again and again to rise above the surface. Finally, the bird's struggles stopped. Its body floated quietly in the oil.
In the Petrow, there's a lot of attention paid to the birds. I think that's probably the longest chapter in the book is chapter 11, the birds. I don't know, like we read about a lot of sad stuff, a lot of depressing topics on the show. And I think reading about oil spills, really anything involving animals like this is always hard with ecological disasters, just because there's like an extra layer of sadness on it because the birds, they don't understand why this is happening. They're just doing the things they always do that's in their nature, and it's killing them. So it's very sad to read. One more brief snapshot from Petrow before we look at more of the big picture ecological impact. This comes from the town of Sheail on the north side of the Cornwall Peninsula in St. Ives Bay. In this quote, Petrow is referring to George Chapman, deputy superintendent of the Sheail generating station.
3 swans swam in the estuary when the oil flooded. At first, Chapman hoped that the beautiful white birds would escape. They definitely kept ahead of the edge of the black tide, retreating as the oil moved in. It was almost as if they knew the oil would kill them, Chapman said later.
As the oil advanced, however, the retreating swans approached a built-up area. Faster and faster they circled, trying to avoid both the black mass on the water and the congested area on land. An arm of oil reached out along one side of the river, threatening to encircle the white birds.
Another arm reached out on the other side, trapping the birds in a small pool of clear water. Then that patch was blotted out by oil. Chapman watched in horror as the brown water lapped at the white birds, coating them with successive layers of crude oil. They were swimming helplessly in circles when he turned away.
So looking bigger picture about the birds of Cornwall, Sheail writes in The Political Dimension.
The tanker could not have grounded at a worse time of the year, as enormous numbers of auks were moving through the area. A meeting of national bodies on March 29th agreed that the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals should take charge of the cleaning of oiled birds. The Royal Society for the Protection of Birds establishing rehabilitation centers. Television pictures of the oiled birds being carefully collected and washed made the rescuers look like heroes. Less than 450 of the 8,000 casualties brought to the center survived the first 3 months.
I feel like that quote's like sort of needlessly shading the rescuers by saying it made them look like heroes. It's like, I think you could still probably call them heroic for even doing that job.
Actually, all the more so that it wasn't overly that has to be a depressing. Imagine going in every day knowing you're going to have to throw away a bunch of dead birds.
Yeah, I mean, these are people who work with birds. I mean, in the Petrow, it talks about some of these bird rescue centers, and usually they're dealing with a bird who has a broken wing or a baby bird that's fallen out of his nest, and they don't know where the mother is, and that kind of thing. So I mean, these are bird people, and having to, like you said, go in every day and know that you are going to have to, dispose of 200-300 dead birds that have, choked to death on oil.
And also, like, this isn't like a sparrow with a broken wing. It's like, hey, we got 10 more oil-covered pelicans this morning.
I feel like that kind of undercuts the actual heroism of the people doing that, just because it wasn't successful, largely.
But also, if I'm one of those 450 birds, it was very successful for me.
There was a lot, and I couldn't include it just for time, but in that chapter of the Petrow, there's a lot of frustrating stuff that goes on with kind of the same with the detergent used at sea, but people coming and offering their service saying, oh, like my company produces this, and this going to be great for these birds. And, using these things and finding that, in some cases, the detergent was worse for them than the oil, or it killed them even faster, or cleaned the oil, but 2 days later, they were bleeding to death internally. So like, there's not a lot of great solutions to it.
Kind of like how bleach would cure COVID in a way.
In a way. In Community and Exclusion, the Torrey Canyon disaster of 1967, Anna Green and Timothy Cooper discuss the devastation wrought on the seabirds in relation to the local communities in Cornwall. While precise records were not collected, approximately 20,000 guillemots, 5,000 razorbills, and smaller numbers of shags, puffins, great northern divers, and other species were considered to have been killed, decimating breeding colonies all around the coast.
Along with the dead and empty rock pools, the sight of thousands of oiled gannets, puffins, razorbills, guillemots, kittiwakes, cormorants, and others washed in with the tide remains vividly in the minds of those who recalled the immense efforts, usually in vain, to save the starving and dying birds.
Something that came up as I was reading about some of these birds is, for a lot of these seabirds, puffins, they're very, very famous for hanging out on like their cliffs and whatnot. A lot of these seabirds, like I think guillemots are one, where they are true seabirds in the sense that they really only come ashore to breed and their babies hatch, and they literally spend their entire lives at sea. So this oil is, that is where they are. Almost 100% of the time is out in the water. This is obviously a massive shakeup to their way of life. The focus of that article is on the community dynamics when confronted with this influx of a large outgroup population. So, news people, government people, military people, all these people swarming into this area where they would not normally be. This article includes a first-hand anecdote from a local builder, Derek Richards, age 27 at the time of the disaster, and his disgust with the seeming callousness of those who had arrived to cover the disaster in the national media. He described it as a, quote, horrible, horrible sight to see the birds. When you picked them up, they just died. The shags, the puffins, you'd see them flapping as they come in. Me being an animal lover, it really hurt. Richards recalled,
these two newspaper guys come down with cameras. He wanted me to pick this little bird up, which was covered in oil, and put him on top of one of the crosses on the graves. So I just done it once. And he said, oh, leave it there. And I said, no way. I'm not leaving that little bird. So I told him to be off and took it away. But they wanted me to leave it and take all these photographs. They didn't give a damn. They just wanted photographs for the papers.
So again, that article focuses on the community and the interactions that are sort of brought into conflict by this. And I just think it's interesting, like that sort of character, have a builder, I guess not someone that you would particularly think of as being overly sentimental, and sort of even him having this reaction to these sort of heartless ghouls in the media, wanting him to pose this bird and take pictures with it so that it looks good in the paper.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And, I think we even kind of see that in today's media from time to time. Unfortunately, I think we saw it just recently with that school shooting in Madison, with some of the reactions to from the mayor. And I think like the local police even of being like, hey, like it doesn't, some of these details you guys want don't matter to like what's going on right now. Like give us a minute. So it is very interesting. Like the the way that the media needs to sensationalize some of this stuff, and they're always looking for that perfect photograph of the dead bird.
Or that perfect story of liberating a prisoner from a Syrian prison.
That one. Yep. That is one too. That is a current event.
I mean, great example of something that you absolutely do not have to embellish for it to be horrible.
Also, something you could have totally done in 1995. You can't do that in 2024. It's too easy to figure.
Chapter 11 of In the Wake of Torrey Canyon has a lot more detail on the specific efforts of those working to save the seabirds. It's overall not a very uplifting read for obvious reasons. Very sad. Let's talk about tourism and fishing. Cornwall was reliant on the local tourism industry. That was its big moneymaker. And the consequences of the spill were felt immediately in this sector.
Near Carbis Bay, the operator of a trailer camp received a letter from the head of a family who had been coming to the camp for years. In view of the oil and the fact that we are keen swimmers, we must cancel our reservations and book elsewhere.
John and Sheila Higgins, in their beach cafe and guest house in Port Leven, awaited the twice-daily visit of the postman with mounting despair. This year, as in the previous year, they had advertised in the Cornwall Guide and the Helston Guide.
They could have expected to get at least 2 inquiries a day. Since the news of the oil disaster, however, they had not had 1 inquiry. The postman only brought bills.
From the reading on kind of the tourism industry in Cornwall, aspects of it remind me a bit of like a Door County.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that seasonal influx of tourism is sort of the lifeblood for the whole year. You know, if something were to happen and you didn't get those, a lot of your smaller businesses probably can't sustain that. You know, even one, not just bad year, but basically a non-existent year would sink a lot of your smaller tourism-based businesses.
Yeah, I think it is kind of cool because especially like with like Door County, it's cool. There aren't a lot of chain places there.
Mm-hmm.
Like everywhere you go, it is small, like mom and pop kind of things. And unfortunately, they're the ones that can least weather an event like this.
If there were a massive oil spill in Green Bay,
theoretically possible.
Another important industry for Cornwall was fishing, which was expected to suffer from both the oil itself and the detergents used to counteract it. However, the situation facing the fishermen of Cornwall wouldn't be quite so dire as it initially appeared. The scientific ship Sarsia had taken a sample from the water around Seven Stones on Easter Monday. From their observations, the fish themselves hadn't been affected by the spill, but the plankton that they fed on were devastated. This was attributed to the detergent rather than the oil.
So what you're saying is we should catch more fish now before they starve to death.
Well, that's actually basically what happens with there's an oyster farm in this area. And I believe it's owned at the time by Prince Charles. And so there's basically this big scramble of them to go out and harvest all of the oysters they can possibly get so that they don't die from the oil.
Prince Charles was out there doing it?
Yes, out there himself. He was using those big old ears to scoop up the oil and keep it away from the oysters.
Is he the one that can't sweat?
No, that's Prince Andrew.
That's right. Yeah.
Prince Charles or King Charles now is the one with the sausage fingers. I'm sure Andrew also has sausage fingers.
I'm sure.
One fishery officer, an Officer Wollaston, suspected that deeper swimming fish would be unaffected by the spill. So he hired the trawler Pioneer out of Newlyn and conducted a 4-day fishing trip to see what they could collect. It's kind of cool, be able to tell the wife you're going off, you're going to work, but it's actually a 4-day fishing trip.
But it is for work.
With the boys. The results were promising. Fish were found in the usual areas frequented by the fishermen, and all fish were caught alive. What wasn't known, of course, was how the detergent or oil may have damaged the fish in non-fatal ways. You know, would this affect their long-term survival or their reproduction? We already saw that a lot of the microorganisms had been really damaged, and that's going to harm your fish population at some point. But by the first weeks of April, concerns about the fishing industry had been handily dealt with, and wholesalers resumed buying fish from Cornwall. So here's a part I had to cut out. Again, the impact on the coast of Brittany they have in many ways similar economy to Cornwall in that there's a lot of tourism and a lot of fishing going on. There was a funny little bit. I believe it was from a French newspaper, and it was a little comic strip about the oil spill and, people being scared of, are they buying fish that is, contaminated with oil? They're like ordering dinner at a restaurant and they ask the waiter about the fish that they've just ordered, like that's on their plate. Is like, are you sure that this fish isn't contaminated with oil? And the waiter responds, oh, no need to worry. That fish is at least 2 weeks old. I thought that was funny.
That was funny.
So again, like the business picks back up and there's really no big impact on the fishing industry.
That's interesting. Like, I would not have expected that. Sounds like the birds really took it on the chin here.
Well, yeah, and I know that's fairly common with oil spills. It really is the coastal dwelling animals and the birds. You know what? Like
those fishermen called the birds? Competition.
It's all a big conspiracy. So let's talk about the investigation here. On Thursday, March 30th, in Genoa, Captain Ruggiati started his first meeting with personnel from the Union Oil Company and their legal representation. Ruggiati was described by a reporter for La Stampa as looking, quote, very dispirited.
To be fair, I probably would too. Wouldn't be feeling great.
Probably good that, this is a thing where, good thing that this was not the era of social media, because that probably wouldn't go well for him. He'd definitely have to delete his Twitter, his Blue Sky.
Yeah. No Instagram for you,
or
sir.
There'd probably be a rule where you're not supposed to be mean to him on Blue Sky.
That's true, yeah.
Ruggiati would be meeting with J. Gifford Gordon of Hill, Dickinson and Company, along with Captain Daryl Povey, Union Oil's resident tanker expert.
That's got to be a good gig.
Yeah.
Like, you don't actually have to go be a captain. Like, you just that's an oil tanker.
Like, I'm assuming he used to be, maybe.
Yeah, I'm sure he worked his way up to that, but I'm saying, like, once you get to that, that's probably good.
Before entering what would be a 14-hour interrogation, Ruggiati spoke to reporters, saying,
for a ship's captain, his ship is all, and I've lost mine. My father was an officer in the Carabinieri. Is it Carbonari?
The Carabinieri.
Carbonieri?
The chicken carbonara.
My father was an officer in the Carbonari, and my sense of duty stems from a family tradition and lifetime at sea.
I think Petrow uses the term interrogation in a sort of tongue-in-cheek way. I mean, yes, it was a long time. I don't think it was particularly hostile.
They weren't like shining like a light on him.
Right. Pretty hot under these lights.
Lighting a cigarette and blowing the smoke in his face. All that.
I feel like to an Italian in the 60s, that would have been like giving him a cup of water.
Sucking that in.
Molto grazie per il fumo. The official inquiry into the accident began on Monday, April 3rd. It was technically held by the Liberian government, since she was Liberian registered, although 3 Americans were selected to conduct it. Basically an American investigation. James Malcolmson of the American Society of Naval Architects was the chairman. He was supported by Kenneth Volk, a maritime lawyer from New York, and Roy Malita of the Office of Maritime Affairs of the Liberian government, stationed in New York. So you've got a bunch of New Yorkers here.
I was going to say, Roy Malita definitely sounds like a native Liberian name.
I mean, Liberians basically have like American names. I mean,
that's true. I forgot Liberia is weird like that. We like reversed.
Charles Taylor, Ellen Johnson. The proceedings are fully detailed in Petrow's book, but we'll skip to the verdict. The board found that human error had caused the accident. One human's error, that being Captain Ruggiati.
The list of accusations against Ruggiati was long. Ruggiati was imprudent in deciding to pass east of the Scillies instead of west. He was also negligent on 5 accounts. Trying to pass between the Seven Stones and the Scillies rather than Seven Stones light vessel in Land's End.
Failing to turn to the right at 8:40 in order to pass through the wider, safer channel.
Permitting Torrey Canyon to sail on automatic pilot while near the Scilly Islands.
Failing to reduce speed at any time prior to stranding.
and failing to establish any regular practice in the operation of the Sperry gyroscope, automatic steering system.
So throughout these, I mean, I know it's important that it's termed negligence. We went into detail in part 2 about what was happening on the bridge, and there we had a lot of questions about how did we get into a situation where these things were possible?
Right.
And that really is what it comes down to with the blame that's laid on Ruggiati. During the inquiry, Ruggiati argued that he had chosen that route in order to save time and make Milford Haven on schedule. However, it was calculated by the investigators that passing 5 miles west of the Scillies would have added approximately 8 miles, or 29 minutes, to the journey.
Uh-oh.
Well within the time limits that Ruggiati was trying to adhere to. Basically saying, okay, if this is what made you make that decision, then something was wrong with your calculations, because this should not have made you behave in such a reckless way that you thought you had to, try to shoot this gap instead of taking the much safer route. Certain aspects of the story were left unresolved. The number of fishing vessels was left up in the air, though the board determined that at no point was there a vessel in a position that would have prevented Ruggiati from turning to starboard. Basically saying, you know what, fine, if you think you saw another vessel, it wasn't here.
Yeah, it didn't have an impact on what happened, even if it existed.
Also, a pivotal moment that we covered in part 2 was left unexplained. The position of the selector lever on the steering stand on the Torrey Canyon's bridge. Helmsman Scotto and Third Officer Cocchio both denied touching the lever. Ruggiati testified that he had left the lever in automatic. So, question being, who put it into control?
The board is unable to resolve these conflicts, but finds that in any event, it is not essential to do so for the purposes of this report. For whether the lever was an automatic or control, the fact is that the master gave no instructions to the helmsman to switch to hand when he ordered hard left. He merely assumed the helmsman would do this, even though there was no set procedure established with regard to the movement of the selection lever.
So really, it does come down to the fact that, regardless of what position it was in and who put it there, that should have been part of his instructions, because presumably the helmsman's not supposed to be changing this based on his own initiative.
Yeah, that invites a gray area of who gets to make the decision.
In a different circumstance, I wouldn't assume that the helmsman's allowed to just switch from, say, auto to manual without telling anyone. So, in light of the findings, the board recommended that Ruggiati's master's license be revoked.
Seems appropriate.
Yeah. I mean, this is one where, as it relates to, the stuff happening on the bridge, it's like, even if other mistakes were made or other people could have solved problems, Ruggiati really is the one who's putting them in the position to make those mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the other thing that we brought up in part 2 is, we had those instances where you have Cocchio making those improper readings on their location, which obviously contributes to it. They're not in the position to have to make those quick readings if Ruggiati doesn't take them into this extremely dangerous area.
Yeah, you're kind of putting them in a position to fail.
So in terms of the legacy, we're into our final little portion here. At the time of her sinking, Torrey Canyon was the largest ship ever to wreck, and the largest hull insurance loss in history, surpassing the Andrea Doria with a price tag of $16,500,000. And although Torrey Canyon has since been surpassed by other supertanker spills, it remains a turning point in how industrial disasters were covered in the media. Quoting here from Frank Uecotter's book, The Vortex, An Environmental History of the Modern World.
Most crucially, the Torrey Canyon offered dramatic pictures. A huge ship breaking apart, military planes in action, polluted beaches, and dying seabirds. It became a new chapter in modernity's infatuation with disaster images.
Whereas Voltaire and Rousseau learned about the 1755 Lisbon earthquake from written sources, modern observers called for photographic evidence.
The Torrey Canyon was one of the first industrial disasters to gain extensive television coverage, and the images created a community of eyewitnesses that spanned the globe. Even more, The event produced the first draft of a cultural script that observers would follow for similar events in the future.
So that was one reason I wanted to cover this story, is the pivotal role that it has in environmental disasters. But I think tying it back in more directly with the aims of this podcast, the Wreck of the Torrey Canyon really exemplifies one of the often recurring themes on this show, and that is a shipwreck, and particularly a modern shipwreck, is never just one thing. Quoting again here from the Vortex.
A number of factors contributed to the crash, and yet none of them doomed the ship. It was the interaction that turned a routine trip into a disaster. It was an unsettling conclusion for those who sought clear lessons, an altogether characteristic one for complex technological systems.
That was one of the things reading about kind of the political impact of this. After the oil is no longer a threat to the UK, and sort of the post-mortem on it all, and everyone is really sort of forced into the uncomfortable conclusion that by and large the UK beaches were saved by basically sheer luck.
Mm-hmm.
The wind wasn't blowing the right direction to hit the beaches right away. It shifted, and that's when you do get the beaches being polluted. But if that wind had been out of, say, the southwest at the beginning, there was nothing they could have done to stop that oil. The things that they did try were largely ineffective. So it really is kind of uncomfortable after the fact to be like, well, what happens next time? Because we didn't really learn anything. This is kind of a burn after reading situation. What does it all mean? We didn't really get a lot out of this. Yeah, unsettling in a way, but I think also kind of like with any disaster, with any accident, it's like you always get something. You always get some sort of knowledge out of one of these disasters. And it's really just trying to learn and act on it. But I mean, as we know, this was not the last oil tanker incident.
Right.
And it would be surpassed numerous times. I would like to cover some more oil tankers. There's a few more that I think have unique qualities to them. This was a lot of work to cover. I had kind of thought of this as just a single episode when I first started wanting to cover it. And
surprise.
It sort of got away from us, but we were able to wrangle it into a good 3-part series, I think. Plus, we have that bonus on Patreon on her sister ship, the Sansanena, who had an equally fiery end in Los Angeles. So this is our final main episode. We do have one more bonus episode I want to squeeze in before the end of the year. It is Russian commerce raiders in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, 1904. But aside from that, I would just say thank you all for listening to another season of Beyond the Breakers. This was our most different season so far, season 4. Kind of made some changes to the structure and the how we plan out the show. But thank you all for continuing to listen. The show's continuing to grow and get more listeners, get more patrons, which is great. Thank you all for listening and for sharing the show, telling people about the show. We're not huge in terms of marketing the show. So really, it has spread almost entirely through word of mouth and people just wanting to share it with their friends and people they know.
There's nothing I want to do less than say, hey, listen to my podcast.
We're not very good at selling the show. So we need our loyal fans to do it for us. Yeah, but that's going to wrap it up here. We will be back in the new year, 2025, with some cool stuff for you.
Yeah, thanks for listening.